Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hermann Genz from the Department of History and Archaeology, and I'm supposed to give the first, I believe, lecture on the Odyssey. So we will deal with a general introduction and then cover the first half of the work. That means books 1 to 12. Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways, who was driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were there whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of. Many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. From some point here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. These sentences mark the beginning of the Odyssey, one of the greatest epics ever to be composed in ancient Greece, and possibly in the entire world. In these few introductory lines, the main topics are already pointed out. The main character of the story is Odysseus. He is one of the heroes of the Trojan War. Also, his main desire is mentioned, homecoming. It furthermore becomes clear that he encountered substantial difficulties in fulfilling his desire. Before we can embark on exploring the contents of the story and get better acquainted with its hero, Odysseus, we first have to look at some background information. Who wrote the story? When was it composed? And what was the society like in the times of Odysseus? The Odyssey was written by the poet Homer in the late 8th century BC. Very little is surprisingly known about Homer. He lived in the second half of the 8th century BC in the area around Smyrna, today's Izmir on the west coast of Turkey. And he wrote at least one other great epic, the Iliad, which tells an episode from the Trojan War. In contrast to many legends which relate that Homer was poor and from a low social class and even blind, an analysis of the epics themselves clearly shows that he was a professional poet associated with the nobility, possibly even of noble origin himself. The high position of a poet at the court in this time is clearly illustrated by the way how Demodocus at the Phaeacian court is described in Book 8 of the Odyssey. Both epics, the Iliad as well as the Odyssey, relate to stories from a distant past, which that is the Trojan War, which according to Greek belief dated around the year 1200 BC. It is hotly debated among modern scholars how far both epics, and especially the story of the Trojan War, actually reflect historical truth. But it may be speculated that at least some historical facts may be concealed in the stories. For the ancient Greeks, however, both the stories reflected historical reality. Homer used stories that were well known in Greece and very likely were orally transmitted for several centuries before Homer wrote them down. The 8th century in Greece was a so-called heroic age. The society was still dominated by kings who reigned over small regional kingdoms in various parts of Greece, and more often they fought against each other than being united. Writing had only recently been introduced from the Near East, in fact, from Phoenicia, so this region. Thus, it is quite astonishing to have lengthy epics of high literary quality, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, as the first literary products of Greece. In fact, one of the earliest inscriptions in Greek from the 8th century BC contains a reference to Homer's Iliad. That is what we see here on this little vessel. A Greek inscription was added there, and that alludes to a drinking cup that King Nestor used in the Iliad. So, obviously, literacy in Greece started with a big bang. Epics themselves, of course, had a longer history in Greece. An epic is a heroic story mixing real, that is historical, and fictional elements. In this case, the appearance of gods and monsters in the stories. Poets and bards sang these epics at the courts of kings and nobles, certainly for entertainment, but more importantly, to transmit values of the society to the audience. These epics, as I already have said, were transmitted orally for a very long time. Thus, the contents were known by most people. Homer, therefore, did not need to tell the whole story of the Trojan War and the homecoming of the heroes, but he could focus on the most dramatic aspects. For the sake of clarity, first the correct chronological order of the events will be summed up. The Odyssey takes its name from its hero Odysseus. Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, a small island on the west coast of Greece. For 10 years, he fought in the Trojan War. Odysseus actually figures as one of the more important heroes in Homer's Iliad, which tells an episode from the Trojan War. It was he who constructed the wooden horse by which the Greeks finally managed to conquer Troy after having besieged it for 10 years. The Odyssey starts after the conquest of Troy. It tells the story of Odysseus' homecoming. After Odysseus had left Troy, he planned directly to sail back to his home on Ithaca with all his men and the spoils of war he had gained when sacking Troy. However, storms and various adventures prevented him from coming home. And during these wanderings, which lasted for another 10 years, he lost all his ships and his companions. The reasons for his misfortunes are mainly due to the wrath of Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, Odysseus had blinded. It has to be pointed out here that Odysseus had no intention to offend the gods. He only blinded the Cyclops in self-defense to save his own life. We will come back to this point at a later point in this lecture. Lastly, Odysseus alone arrived on the island of the nymph Calypso, who fell in love with him and wanted to marry him. She even offered him eternal life. Odysseus, however, was still determined to return home, and at last built a raft on which he managed to reach the island of Scheria, where the Phaeacians lived. He received a hearty welcome there, and after having spent some time as a guest of King Alcinous, he was brought by the Phaeacians back to his own island of Ithaca. As Odysseus, upon his return, had no idea what was going on in his own home, on the advice of the goddess Athena, he disguised himself as a beggar to find out about the situation on Ithaca. He first stayed with Eumaeus, the swineherd, who informed him about the general situation. Odysseus kept his disguise and only lifted it when he met his own son Telemachus. Telemachus brought Odysseus to the palace, where again he went in the disguise of a beggar. There he finds out how the suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, abuse the concept of hospitality, and he actually is being humiliated by them himself. When his wife Penelope interviews him, he tells her a false story of his fate. That means he keeps his disguise. The story comes to its climax when Penelope proposes a contest for the suitors in which they are to string Odysseus' bow and shoot an arrow through the shaft holes of 12 axes. She then will marry the winner of this contest. Not surprisingly, none of the suitors can even string the bow, and in the end only Odysseus is able to fulfill the task. He finally reveals himself, and together with his son Telemachus and the help of Athena, kills all the suitors. But Penelope remains cautious, and before finally accepting that Odysseus has really returned, puts him to a last test when asking him about the special features of the bed in their own bed chamber. The trick is, she tells him that the bed was moved, and that is virtually impossible because the bed is built around an olive tree that grows in the house, so it cannot be moved. The story ends with another fighting scene in which the relatives of the killed suitors seek revenge, but this fight is ended by a peace imposed by the goddess Athena. Homer, however, told the story in a slightly different way. As I already said, as the contents of the story of Odysseus were already well known in Homer's time, the poet does not need to tell the events in correct chronological order. He only focused on the most decisive points of the story. Altogether, the Odyssey only covers a period of 40 actual days, starting from the point when Odysseus is finally allowed to leave the island of Calypso until his re-establishment as the king of Ithaca. Homer's Odyssey is subdivided into 24 books or chapters. Book 1 acts as a kind of prologue, in which, by a council of the gods, Odysseus finally is allowed to return home from the island of Calypso. Books 2 to 4, instead of setting Odysseus on his way home, first tell the story of the journey which Odysseus' son Telemachus undertakes to find out news about his father. These books convey important information, as they explain to the reader the desolate situation in Odysseus' kingdom. Although Odysseus had been away for 20 years by now, his wife, Penelope, still does believe that he will return someday. However, a group of suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, urge her to forget Odysseus and marry one of them instead. This situation is bound to create tensions. Will Penelope remain loyal to Odysseus? How will the suitors react should Odysseus eventually return home? And what about Telemachus, Odysseus' son? He was a small baby when his father left for the war, so how will he react when his father finally returns? It is only in Book 5 that we return to our hero Odysseus and learn how he built a raft by which he leaves Calypso's island. On his way home to Ithaca, he is shipwrecked once more due to Poseidon's wrath, who conjures up a storm and barely manages to reach Scheria, the island of the Phaeacians. In books 6 to 12, Odysseus' stay on the island of Scheria is described, and in books 9 to 12, he actually tells the story of his wanderings and adventures to the Phaeacians. This order of events is quite important. When we first meet Odysseus on Calypso's island, he is a broken man, weeping out of desperation. But by retelling all his adventures to the Phaeacians, he regains his confidence and thus gains the strength to restore order to his own kingdom. From book 13 onwards, Homer's vision follows the correct chronological order as detailed above. So this arrangement of the story actually reflects the succeeding stages of Odysseus' homecoming. Books 5 to 12 deal with Odysseus' wanderings in the Mediterranean. Books 13 to 16 see Odysseus on his island of Ithaca, but still outside of the palace. Books 17 to 22 see Odysseus inside the palace. And in book 23, Odysseus finally reaches his own bedchamber, the innermost part of the palace. In order to just detail this scheme, let me just briefly explain that. So the arrow represents the timeline covering 20 years. So the first 10 years we have the Trojan War. The second 10 years, on top of the arrow, we have Odysseus' wanderings in the Mediterranean. As I said, in Homer's version of the Odyssey, only the last 40 days are covered. So this is the bracket on the downside of the arrow here. But in books 6 to 9, 9 to 12, we have so-called retrospective, where Odysseus tells the Phaeacians about his adventures, from the fall of Troy to his stay on the island of Chypre. Did you all understand me?
No, we couldn't hear you.
It should be noted that Odysseus' wanderings, the second 10 years of his adventures, take place outside the real world. What do I mean by this? Only the starting point, Troy, and the end point, Ithaca, are places that can securely be pointed out on a map. All other locations of Odysseus' adventures have no secure position in the Mediterranean or elsewhere, and the various attempts by different scholars to identify the names of the places in the epic with real place names are no more than guesswork. So the island of the Cyclopes, the island of the nymph Calypso, the island of Scheria, and so on, we have no idea where they are located. In contrast, the false stories which Odysseus tells several times about his wanderings are all situated in the real world, and places he claims to have visited can be identified, such as the island of Crete, Phoenicia, Egypt, and so on. These are all regions we know the location of. So Homer actually plays a rather interesting trick here. Odysseus' real wanderings take place outside of the real world. Odysseus' false stories about his adventures take place in the real world. So you may want to discuss the very interesting concept Homer has here about imagination versus reality. There are certainly many ways how to read the Odyssey. First of all, it is a fascinating adventure story, and without doubt was also understood as such in ancient Greece. However, the story also conveys moral issues important for the ancient Greek society. Let us first take a look at Odysseus, the hero of the story, as the main characters of such stories, such epics, always served as role models for the society in general. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, is the hero of the story. He is characterized by a number of attributes. First of all, he is a hero. That means he can and does fight, if necessary. An example of his superior strength is given in the story of the bow contest in Book 21, line 409 and following, I quote, "So without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow," end of quote. Second, he's a pious man. He always honors the gods. Most important, however, is his intelligence, his resourcefulness. Remember, it was not the brutal strength of Achilles, another Greek hero that led to the conquest of Troy, but Odysseus' plan of devising a stratagem, the wooden horse, as mentioned in Book 8, line 492 and following. It is not only a cleverness helping him to survive, such as in the case of the escape from the cave of the Cyclops, but a genuine curiosity. For instance, Odysseus enters the cave of the Cyclops out of pure curiosity. He does not really need to go in there. This is borne out in Book 9, line 172 and following, where Odysseus tells his companions, I quote, "While I go and find out about these people and learn what they are, whether they are savage and violent and without justice, or hospitable to strangers and with minds that are godly," end of quote. Another example is Odysseus' way of interrogating the spirits of the dead in the underworld, described in Book 11, line 228 and following, where Odysseus says, "I then thought about a way to question them," end of quote. He's referring here to the spirits of the dead. Again, he just does that to gain knowledge, to satisfy his curiosity, but not for any personal advantages. Odysseus is able to endure suffering to achieve his goals. It is basically the longing for his home and his family that let him endure all his misfortunes. So most important is his determination. He uses all his resources to achieve one goal: coming home to his wife and son. Compared to the motivation of Gilgamesh, the story that you just read, this seems a somewhat unheroic goal. However, it certainly makes Odysseus a more sympathetic character, not only for modern eyes. So, Odysseus has been called the first modern man by the 20th century philosophers Adorno and Horkheimer. He is not only a hero with strength and courage. Most famous he is for his resourcefulness, his ingenuity. It is not only an ingenuity born out of the necessity to survive, but a genuine curiosity. It is the combination of his different attributes, his courage, his ability to endure suffering, but most important, his resourcefulness and curiosity, which truly make him one of the most fascinating Greek heroes. It is especially the latter attributes that actually pave the way to the Greek Enlightenment during the 5th and 4th centuries BC, when philosophers and historians show the same kind of curiosity. And you will read some of these books later on during this course, the works of Plato, of Socrates, and so on. Further moral issues concern different points in the epic. Proper behavior in general, for instance. Homer, interestingly, is somewhat ambiguous when it comes to the question of fate versus free will. Several passages seem to indicate that the fate for humans was set by the gods. For instance, Book 1, lines 16 to 17, I quote, "But when in the circling of the years that very year came in which the gods had spun for him his time of homecoming," end of quote. It seems obvious that Odysseus was fated to wander around for 10 years after the Trojan War. He could do nothing to change it. On the other hand, there are passages that indicate that the gods often revise their decisions according to the behavior of humans. So man is at least partly responsible for his fate. Recklessness and wrongdoing will lead to punishment by the gods, or in the case of the suitors, by Odysseus himself. To illustrate that, I brought you another quote here, again from Book 1, lines 6 to 9. I quote, "Even so he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the days of their homecoming." End of quote. So the key words here are, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. So it was nothing the gods had fated, it was just something the Odysseus' men did, and they were punished accordingly. A second quotation is also taken from Book 1, lines 32 to 34, where Zeus, the supreme god, addresses the assembly of gods in the following words, I quote, "Oh, for shame, how the mortals put the blame upon us gods, for they say evils come from us, but it is they rather who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what can." End of quote. So again, we hear it out of Zeus' own mouth, but he says, it is they rather who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what is given. Ideas about proper behavior are expressed on several different occasions in the epic. A very important part is the proper treatment of foreigners and guests. I believe Trump has never read the Odyssey. Compare the correct behavior shown by King Nestor in Book 3, Telemachus, Odysseus' son, in Book 1, and the Phaeacians in Book 7, who all receive a variety of guests, even Odysseus, who is disguised as a beggar, for instance, with the improper behavior of the Cyclops, described in Book 9, lines 250 and following, where instead of receiving Odysseus and his men as guests, the Cyclops tries to devour them. Of course, also the guests themselves have obligations. The suitors in Odysseus' palace clearly misbehave. They outstay their welcome, they harass and insult other guests and Odysseus' wife, even insulting Odysseus himself, who we have to admit is still disguised as a beggar, described in Book 17, lines 445 and following. So, what, according to this epic, makes human life valuable? Fame is an important component for any man to establish his position in society. The Odyssey, interestingly, is remarkable for putting less stress on fame gained by heroic deeds in battle. See, for instance, the speech of Achilles in the underworld in Book 11, lines 488 and following. So Achilles died during the Trojan War, and Odysseus later on, when he visits the underworld, meets the dead Achilles in the underworld, and Achilles says the following, I quote, "O shining Odysseus, never console me for dying. I would rather follow the plow as a thrall," meaning a slave, "to another man, one with no land allotted him and not much to live on, than be a king of over all the perished dead." End of quote. So Achilles, while formerly just mad for glory gained in battle, suddenly reviews his decision and says, no, living is actually much better. And even if it's a non-glorious life, just as a slave, it's better to be dead. So more stress in the Odyssey is put on fame won at home by leading a proper life with family and friends. That is borne out in Book 19, line 332 and following, where it is stated, I quote, "But when a man is blameless himself and his thoughts are blameless, the friends he has entertained carry his fame widely." End of quote. These certainly can be seen as unheroic elements of society. Again, contrast this attitude with the one propagated by the Epic of Gilgamesh. However, it has to be emphasized that Odysseus is not portrayed as a peaceful man or even a coward. He can and does fight if necessary, but he is not only praised for his strength and his fighting qualities, but rather for his intelligence and his resourcefulness. In addition, reputation rests on being a just man. Look at Book 4, line 689 and following, where it is said about Odysseus, I quote, "What kind of man Odysseus was among your own parents, how he did no act and spoke no word in his own country that was unfair. And that is a way divine kings have. One may be hateful to a certain man and favor another, but Odysseus was never outrageous to any man." End of quote. What about attitudes towards the truth? When asked who he is, Odysseus several times embarks on a false story. That is, for instance, in Books 13, Book 14, Book 19, and so on. This he does not do for simple cheating, but to protect himself until he finds out more about the situation in his country. It has been noted above that his false stories actually sound more credible than his real wanderings, as in the false stories no gods and monsters appear, and the places he names actually can all be located. It is also important to note that once Odysseus reveals himself, from Book 22 onwards, he does not tell false stories anymore. So, the more general attitude towards the truth in this epic is that the concept of truth is often hidden. It has to be pointed out that also people and even gods in the epic regularly appear in disguise. Odysseus entering his own palace disguised as a beggar, goddess Athena, for instance, appearing to Odysseus as a shepherd boy, and so on. So the moral of the epic in this case certainly is that one should not accept things as they appear to be on first sight, but to seek for a hidden truth. Lying is not condemned in the epic if it serves a certain purpose, like hiding one's identity, for instance. See, for instance, Athena's speech to Odysseus in Book 13, lines 291 and following, where Athena addresses Odysseus with the following words, I quote, "You wretch, so devious, never wary of tricks, then you would not even in your own country give over your deceiving and your thievish tales. They are near to you in your very nature." Now, that sounds like a criticism, right? But Athena continues, "But come, let us talk no more of this, for you and I both know sharp practice, since you are the best of all mortal men for counsel and stories, and I, among all the divinities, am famous for wit and sharpness." End of quote. So here, Athena, a goddess, interestingly compares her intellectual capabilities to that of Odysseus, a mere mortal man. So that certainly means praise. So what about relations between man and gods in the epic? The ancient Greeks believed in many gods. Besides the 12 main, the so-called Olympian gods, there was a multitude of minor gods, For instance, the nymph Calypso that we meet in the epic. This situation is, of course, bound to create problems, as the gods do not always agree with each other. In the Trojan War, they even openly fight with each other, as some gods support the Trojan side, whereas others favor the Greeks. The gods in the Odyssey are all described with human characteristics. They quarrel, they're greedy, and they're sometimes plainly unjust. Poseidon's hatred towards Odysseus clearly is a case of unjust behavior. Poseidon's wrath is purely based on personal motives, as Odysseus has blinded his son, the Cyclops. It is not a case of punishing Odysseus for unjust or immoral behavior. Remember, Odysseus just blinded the Cyclops to save his own life. What was he supposed to do? Not all the gods are thus portrayed as higher moral authorities in the epic. Only Zeus clearly stands out as representing the principle of justice. So the only aspects that distinguished all the gods from humans are their superhuman powers and the fact that gods, in contrast to humans, are immortal. The gods do not only watch humans from far away, but actively engage themselves in human affairs. In a negative way, for instance, Poseidon shattering Odysseus' raft, described in Book 5, or in a positive way, Athena advising and protecting Odysseus, even making plans together with him. That is related in Book 13. So the gods are part of human life and are portrayed by humans according to their own image. Nevertheless, it is made explicitly clear that the gods need to be honored. Odysseus is described as a pious man by Zeus himself. Book 1, line 65 and following, where Zeus says about Odysseus, I quote, how could I forget Odysseus, the godlike, he who is beyond all other men in mind, and who beyond others has given sacrifice to the gods who hold wide heaven. End of quote. Finally, the story of the Cyclops, as related in Book 9, is certainly one of the key events in the first 12 books. This will be discussed here in some more detail to illuminate some of the key concepts of the Odyssey. So, I've already briefly outlined the story. During his wanderings, Odysseus reaches an unknown island. He goes ashore with some of his men to find out what people are living there, and he enters the cave of the Cyclops. When the Cyclops returns, instead of receiving Odysseus and his men as guests, as would be proper, he just blocks the entrance of the cave and prepares to eat Odysseus and his men. In fact, I think he manages to kill 4 of Odysseus' men before Odysseus finally makes him drunk and blinds him by poking his eye out. When looking at the description of the way of life of the Cyclopes, we obtain a clear idea of the Greek concept of civilization versus barbarity. The Cyclopes lack all the essential features the Greeks associated with civilization. The Cyclopes are described as having no agriculture, living in caves instead of proper houses, they have no laws, they have no council meetings, they're not fearing the gods, and they do not respect the law of hospitality. So if you actually take the exact opposite of what the Cyclopes do, you get an idea of what Greeks associated with civilized behavior. Furthermore, this story brings out the main characteristics of Odysseus. It is first of all Odysseus' curiosity which brings him and his companions into a terribly dangerous situation. On the other hand, through his cleverness and courage, Odysseus manages to rescue them again. And the problem was, as the Cyclops had blocked the entrance to the cave with a huge rock boulder, which Odysseus and his men could not remove, so they could not simply kill the Cyclops, they had to blind him. And Odysseus actually carefully pondered all this. He could have easily killed the Cyclops, but then they would have still been trapped in the cave. Lastly, this story clearly illustrates the concept of being a hero. When first asked for his name by the Cyclops, Odysseus answers that it was nobody. Very strange answer. This somewhat enigmatic response is explained only when, after being blinded, the Cyclops calls for help from his fellow Cyclopes dwelling nearby. When they all rush to our Cyclops cave and hear that nobody has blinded him, the other Cyclopes reassuredly return to their caves and say, oh, maybe it's just a nightmare or something like that. While this clever trick saved Odysseus and his companions from the other Cyclopes, it unfortunately is at odds with the concept of heroism. A hero needs his proper name to be associated with the deeds he has done. He needs the fame. Nobody, let's say, will listen to a story where it said, oh, someone, I don't recall his name, did this and this, and yeah, it was really great, but I don't really recall who it was. So it is for this reason, not just for pure recklessness, that Odysseus, once he has escaped from the cave, announces his proper name to the Cyclops. The tragic irony of this act is that the Cyclops now has, as we would call it, the personal details of his adversary, and he asks his father Poseidon to punish Odysseus. As we learn from the story, Odysseus will have to pay a heavy price for this and will have to use all his courage and intelligence to escape Poseidon's wrath. But that is a story for the next lecture, I believe. So, I'm already at the end of my lecture, a bit earlier than expected. Okay, that's it. Thank you.